So that's another piece of authenticity that makes it hard, because we can feel, I could just said to you, well, I might tell a story one way over coffee with a friend, I might tell it another way to my 5-year-old, I might speak and tell that story in front of an audience of business owners. That could be the same story. It could be an authentic story to me, told in a variety of different ways to different audiences, because I want them to receive that story. But am I being authentic?
Welcome to the Storycraft Podcast for storytellers. I'm your host, Meg Adams, and I'm here to help you explore how stories shape our connections. Wondering how stories help you network and advance? Looking to bridge online and face-to-face worlds, foster understanding, and ignite innovation? Look no further. Whether you're a leader, communicator, educator, or just love a good story, join us for actionable insights and real talk with professional storytellers, all aimed at helping you build stronger, better connections.
So I wanted to talk about this topic on the podcast for a while. I've been thinking about it, the idea of authenticity. I have had, I don't want to say an issue with authenticity, but I think it gets misconstrued in the advice that we get when it comes to telling your story, getting online, getting out for your brand in front of people, being interviewed, all these things that we're told to do as thought leaders, as brands, as entrepreneurs, small business owners. We as storytellers are given this advice to be ourselves, to be authentic. And I see it over and over and over. And I wanted to talk today about a way to rethink authenticity that I believe is really going to help you come into your own, to be more confident and comfortable when you tell your story, because authenticity doesn't exist. So I also want to preface this conversation. I did a little bit of research beforehand, because Merriam-Webster actually made authentic one of their words of the year for 2023. So I thought I would look up the actual definition from Merriam-Webster about what authentic actually means. So here it is for you. So Merriam-Webster defines authentic as not false or imitation. Cool, right? We're not imitating anybody else. We're not being false. It's a synonym of the word real and actual. And when we're thinking about authentic in terms of identity, it means being true to one's own personality and spirit or character. And when I read that last part, right, true to one's own personality and spirit and character, I was like, wow, that's a hefty load. That feels like a lot to be on someone's shoulders, to be true. Now, some of you might think, oh yeah, I'm going online, I'm being true, this is who I am. Again, I'm going to get into a little bit about why that can feel overwhelming or why that's problematic, okay? So and also I wanted to say that Merriam-Webster agrees with me, because even in that definition, they said one of the reasons why authenticity was so popular and they picked it to be the word of the year in 2023 was because it actually is hard to define. And where they saw it being used a lot was in conversations about AI, also in, celebrity culture, identity, and social media. So all these conversations were happening in 2023, hence why Merriam-Webster chose authentic as word of the year. But, okay, it is hard to define, because when you ask somebody what they mean when they're being authentic, they're probably going to say something like, well, it's being that first definition. I'm being true to myself. I'm being true to my personality, my character, my spirit, which is a great thing to be, and I don't want to diminish that. But here's why it's hard to put into practice. It's hard to define, but really hard to put into practice. So I think the first reason I think being authentic is hard to put into practice is because when we think of stories, when we're telling stories from experiences. And oftentimes we're telling those stories after the experience, which means they're from our memory. And hopefully if you're watching this, memory is faulty. So it's why a lot of times eyewitness accounts are all over the place. Like one person can see one thing, another person can see another thing, but the longer they wait to get an eyewitness account, the more faulty it is, because research shows that false memories form more regularly when enough time has passed that the original memory has faded. Like, we all know this. We're probably not remembering things correctly. we all want to be the hero of our own story, so we might omit some details here and there. And so while memory is very valuable and experience is very valuable, we're filtering all that through the lens of our perspective, which is going to favor ourselves. And that's okay. Like that's not right or wrong. That is what it is though. And that can be problematic when we start to say that what we're saying is authentic or what we're saying is true. Because it's true to us, absolutely. It's authentic to us, but we still have to understand that that's a little faulty. Which leads into, I think, the next issue with authenticity when it comes to storytelling, and this one is the most obvious one, and that's that we all perform. So I had a friend say, she was sitting in the audience when I gave my keynote, my first big keynote last year to a group of businesswomen, and she said, I love everything you did. You're amazing up there. It's like you were born to speak. And she said something to me. She said, it's like you were a bigger version of yourself. Like you had more personality than you do in person, which I mean, I guess that I take as a compliment, but also just that acknowledgement that, yeah, like I'm performing when I'm in front of an audience, depending on the environment, again, who is in that audience, I'm going to perform for them. And I get energy being on stage. When there's a microphone in my hand, I'm like a little bit more Meg. I'm a little bit more, my personality does come out in that way. And same thing when it's in front of a camera for a lot of people, or even if you're talking to somebody and having coffee or at a networking event, like you are going to be a version of yourself in that moment. You're going to perform. That is totally normal, totally fine, but it lends some problems to authenticity, right? As an idea, because authenticity is showing up as your true self, as your authentic self. We're going to pull a definition. True to one's own personality, spirit, or character. I would add at any given moment. So that's the thing here. Like we're performing at any given moment to our situation, which makes being authentic problematic. So hopefully you've got that concept there, because that's the other point that I wanted to make today, messages. So when we're talking about authenticity as a storyteller, we understand, just like I said, we're performing in a certain environment for a certain audience and their expectations.
Love what you're hearing on this podcast? Consider booking me to speak at your next event. Dive further into the transformative power of storytelling with my keynote. Tell better stories, speak up, stand out, and build community. In a world that often amplifies our differences, my talk invites you to embrace genuine connections. Break free from the echo chambers and discover the art of storytelling. Learn how to share your own narrative, listen actively, and foster communities that flourish on shared experiences. Check out the show notes to learn more about how to book a talk for your next event.
The other piece that's really hard for a lot of us who speak or putting ourselves out there on social media or teaching, or again, anytime you share a story, you're being a little vulnerable, because that vulnerability comes because your audience is co-creating the message with you. This is a big thing I like to point out when I talk about storytelling and coaching people and working with clients in interviews is, yeah, to a certain extent, you can't control how somebody else is going to interpret what you say. You're going to, obviously, we hope that that's positive, and that's a little bit of the reason as to why we perform. There's certain etiquettes, like I will speak differently to, my partner or at a coffee with a close friend than I'm going to perform at a networking event or a business meeting. Again, because I know that based on that performance, people are going to interpret what I say and what I do based on, again, how well I perform in that environment. So that's another piece of authenticity that makes it hard, because we can feel, I could just said to you, well, I might tell a story one way over coffee with a friend. I might tell it another way to my 5-year-old. I might speak and tell that story in front of an audience of business owners. That could be the same story. It could be an authentic story to me, told in a variety of different ways to different audiences, because I want them to receive that story. But am I being authentic? Right? Because maybe I'm using different details. Maybe I'm using a different tone of voice. Sometimes I use the term like chameleon, and I don't I feel like maybe I'm not being authentic. Maybe you feel that way too. And that's just how we relate. That's how we perform as human beings. But again, that idea, when we think about that through the lens of the concept of authenticity, it can feel inauthentic to do that in that example that I just gave you. So those are three things that cause me to think twice when I think of authenticity, cause me to think through the problems and get overwhelmed maybe. And maybe you feel the same way. You're like, oh, I have to be my authentic self. Like, who am I? I don't even know. Like, I'm figuring it out, right? And so the fourth thing that I want to say about authenticity is you don't have to talk about everything in it, and you really shouldn't. So, and let me explain this a little more. So the fourth thing that complicates the idea of being authentic in any situation is that we might feel pressured, especially in our environment that we're in today. If you are out there for whether you're your brand, right? You could have a personal brand, you could have an organizational or business brand, whether you're a thought leader, educator. I mean, all of us feel, I think, on some respects, a pressure to speak out or to talk about things. And I just sort of want to give you permission to say you can still be authentic to who you are and understand that there are certain things that you probably shouldn't talk about. You shouldn't have an opinion on if you don't intimately understand it or you haven't in some way experienced that topic to say something about it, substantial or something meaningful or something that's going to add to the conversation. And I see this happen a lot, and I've seen this happen a lot in the past 5-ish years, especially online, with influencers or brands where we feel pressure to speak out. And there are times when you do have to speak out. Again, this is for everybody to sort of figure out on their own. But I do think that as we begin to align with certain aspects of identity, the one that is most obvious to me as an example would be like our political identities. You know, we'll start to draw lines in the sand about where we are on, either side of an issue. And then we feel pressure like, oh, well, my team, like my party is, everybody's talking about this. I should probably say something too. And I would say, no, you probably shouldn't. Like, unless you feel compelled in your heart, unless you've had a personal experience or an intimate experience with whatever that issue is, you don't need to add your story in there. What you can do is you can elevate the story of other people who have had that intimate experience, who are maybe in your circle that you trust, that you know. You can share their stories. That's a way of speaking or adding, letting people know how you feel, but you're not being inauthentic because it's not your story. I hope that makes sense. But I think that I see that a lot, and I just think it's an easier way to not feel that pressure to have to always be on or always have to say something. Like, we can think about, number one, listening, which is a huge part of story exchange, and also elevating the voices of others who have had that intimate experience, who will have more thoughtful things to say than us. So if you are telling stories that you don't feel you have intimate experience with, you're going to feel inauthentic. So that's another issue with authenticity that I have. So that brings me to the climax, if you will, the lesson of this podcast episode is like, what do we do with this? Okay, like, we've talked about all these issues with authenticity, or why I think it really doesn't exist. And I have a wonderful resource. And the reason why this popped up for me is I read this article in grad school. It's by a woman named Jacqueline Jones Royster. She wrote an article called When the First Voice You Hear Is Not Your Own. And she really deals with a lot of these issues around how we tell our stories, how we interpret and listen to stories, and how we co-create meaning together to build communities. But she kind of gives us a little bit of advice about what to do on this particular subject. So she writes the article in scenes, but she starts with her own story to tell us how she sees the problem of authenticity being the same thing I said, like, authenticity doesn't exist. So she talks about how, she was giving an address. She's talking to an audience of academics, and after she gives her talk, someone comes up to her and she says, one very well-intentioned response to what I did that day was, how wonderful it was that you were willing to share with us your authentic voice. I said, my quote, authentic voice. And she said, oh yes, I've never heard you talk like that. So relaxed. I mean, you're usually great, but that was really great. You weren't so formal. You didn't have to speak in an appropriated academic language. You sounded natural. It was nice to hear you be yourself. And so she replied, she said, oh, I see. Yes, I do have a range of voices, and I take quite a bit of pleasure actually in being able to use any of them at will. Not understanding the point that I was trying to make gently, she said, but this time it was really you. Thank you. So there's a lot packed into that little scene that she gave us, but I think the biggest thing is, and I hope that this is a takeaway that you have, is that we are not all one voice. We are not one. Our authentic voice is going to change, right? As we evolve as humans, as we look back. I love Taylor Swift. I'm a big fan of Taylor Swift, but I love her concept of eras. And if you're a Taylor Swift fan, you know what I'm talking about. Like, she has these eras, and each era has a personality. It has a theme, if you will. And she's just, a lot of what she does in her music is tell stories about past versions of herself, and she's defined them into eras based on her albums. I think this is the same way. We can think about our own storytelling in the same way. We all go through different eras. There are different versions of us. And in the past, present, and future, right, there's going to be different versions of us. But there's also different versions of us at any given moment. Like I said, depending on situations that we're in, where we're from, how we speak. And so, yeah, we're going to change those a little bit. But does that mean that we're not being authentic, right? Well, Jacqueline Jones Royster would say no. And then she uses another quote from Bell Hooks, who's another scholar that I would definitely check out. But she says, it's a necessary aspect of self-affirmation not to feel compelled to choose one voice over another, not to claim one as more authentic, but rather to construct social realities that celebrate, acknowledge, and affirm differences, variety. So then Royster says, I claim all my voices as my own very much authentic voices, even when it's difficult for others to imagine a person like me having the capacity to do that. So again, it's this idea that we can have many voices. We don't have to be one thing. And there's actually a lot of genius in the hybridity. Like, when you are able to see things from different vantage points, when you are able to speak and connect and relate to people because of the experiences, the stories that you have, and you can do that in different ways, you're not being inauthentic. You're just creating a new story. You're creating a new viewpoint. You're finding new ways to connect. And so we should all practice that. And I know I'm curious to hear, like, I'd love to hear from you after listening to this episode, if that has like spurred anything for you. Like, how can we do that? What are good examples of people maybe that you follow online or look up to, or are thought leaders? How are they embodying this? How are brands embodying this? I know we hear a lot of advice about, stick to this story, stick to this thing, this niche, this is what you do. And people expect the same thing over and over, but that's not reality. That's not who we are. And that doesn't allow that genius to emerge. It really limits us, I think, when we feel like we have to perform in this one way. We have to be this one person. We have to show up always the same. And again, I think it really does limit our capacity to think through things too, to see things from a different vantage point, to connect across difference, because we're limiting ourselves when we're feeling like we have to be this one sole, authentic person. We have to be ourselves. Well, ourselves are constantly changing, right? Depending on, like I said, the situation, the era, the version of yourself that you're in, and all those things that we talked about in the episode. So let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what you think of this. If you have any questions about how to be authentic, I'm using air quotes for listeners, and how to stay, I would say, true to all those different versions of yourself at any given time as you get out there and you tell stories. I think we can do this successfully, and I think it would make a real difference in terms of building our own relationships and connections as we build community together. And if you like this episode and you know somebody who also might have something to say about this topic, please do share it with them because I'd love, love, love to get a conversation started. I'm on social at Dr. Meg Adams, or you can send me an email at megan@homeplacecreativeco.com. Thanks. We're so glad you've listened to this podcast episode. If you liked it, would you mind doing us a favor? Share this episode with someone who would be interested in the topic too. We're on a mission to help everyone become a better storyteller. And don't forget to subscribe to the show to get updated every time we release a new episode. Each and every episode is produced, hosted, and edited by us, Meg and Kyle Adams at Homeplace Creative. Happy storytelling!